And so, again, going back to the Currency Act of 1764, when the Crown says when the Crown states they don't want the colonists printing their own money because they have to pay the banks back. And the banks don't want to be paid back in colonial script. How much is that money worth? Yeah, compared to gold and silver at the time, yeah, that's about right. And so this is an issue. With we closing on the war, because the British don't want to station troops in the outback, you see here the Crown stating, okay, you can't grab land anymore. How do you think that's going to go over here? Not very well. We can't print our own money, and we can't control the land. Two criteria here for revolution. And so when you begin to take, as the British are withdrawing troops from the outback and sticking them in the cities, 1772, 73, 74, 75, and you know, the cities that exist. Who are they? What are they? Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Charleston? How many real cities are there? And so they're leaving the outback unattended. And what's going on here? You're seeing, you know, spontaneous uprisings in the countryside. You know, where the local people are pushing out Crown-appointed administrators and asserting local control. Committees of public safety. And at the same time, as this begins to snowball in some colonies more than others, and you can probably imagine, Massachusetts is a hotbed. You know, you got people like Sam Adams up there. So, and so as this begins to snowball, also this idea of putting together militias to protect the committees of safety goes along with it. Now keep in mind, these militias have some of them have already had combat experience fighting with the British as paramilitaries against the French and Indians in the French and Indian War. George Washington had that experience in Pennsylvania. And so, you know, some of these guys already have combat experience, but as adjuncts to the British Army. Now, the day is coming where they're going to fight against the British Army. Interesting when you, again, I have referenced this in earlier talks, but again, it bears repeating. You see this process repeated in places like Russia in 1917, you know, in the Petrograd, where soldiers, peasants, and workers are rising up to push out Tsar-appointed administrators. And they're going to start putting together militias to protect these, what they're going to call Soviets. Committees. Committees, that's what they are. And so, interestingly enough, you have something in common. Your revolution has something in common with the Russian Revolution. You know, I've been giving talks on Helen Keller, and only from the perspective of Helen Keller as a socialist, which she was. Conveniently, that's left out of the narrative usually, isn't it? In fact, I got a number of her writings as a socialist. She supported Lenin's revolution in 1917. The workers are finally getting their day. Interesting some of the people in the early part of the 20th century in this country. But at the same time here, you see these committees of safety. And so you're beginning to see the organization of revolt. And so as you take a look at a state like Massachusetts with Nathan Fisk, that militant cleric who's rousing people to arms here, you know, going from town to town to town. This cleric is going from town to town to town. Rise up, grab a gun, shoot the British. Makes Jerry Falwell look like a choir boy. And you begin to see the organization of militancy here. And so you can't have these spontaneous uprisings. It's getting to the point where it's got to be organized. You know, we're going 1772, 73, 74, 75, and it could get ugly. Like that incident up in New Milford. For the benefit of those of you who didn't attend a talk I gave on this, where, you're seeing patriots versus Tories and loyalists. It's a civil war, folks. That's how your revolution really starts, as a civil war among the colonists. You know, there's some who want to depart the crown. There are some who do not want that divorce from the crown, and they're called Tories and Loyalists. Well, up in New Milford, 1775, this is in a book called Anatomy of Revolution. If you're into revolutions, that's a Bible to read by Crane Brinton. And he outlines an incident up in New Milford, and where these loyalists found out they had a Tory in their midst, and they ordered this guy. They went to his farm, and they ordered this guy, grab one of your geese, and they marched this guy at gunpoint 20 miles to Litchfield. And guess what's waiting there? A vat of boiling hot tar. They stripped this guy as naked as a jaybird, hit him with that boiling hot tar, and of course this guy had already plucked the goose. They whipped him with the feathers. What do you call that? Torture or terrorizing? Yeah, we were doing this long before the Iranians were doing it, so don't believe what you're listening on the news, for crying out loud. But that's part and parcel. You want to win, you win. But you can't have this go on, because what's going to happen? Spontaneous uprising. Someone's got to get control of this, because it's only a matter of time before the British start thinking, it's okay, let's see if we can separate the New England colonies from the rest of the colonies and split them. You can't have that. But keep in mind, you're dealing with 13 independent colonies who want to jealously guard their independence. It's hard in a way to get this together. But you see the beginnings of this, and a year before the Declaration of Independence, and no one talks about this document. It's a year before the Declaration of Independence, July 6, 1775, Continental Congress, and it's signed off on by John Hancock, the president of the Continental Congress. This document is called The Causes and Necessity for Taking Up Arms. You know, that's kind of in your face. Yet nobody remembers that one, as opposed to the one that comes out the following year, the Declaration of Independence. But with the Declaration of Independence, representatives from 13 colonies signed this thing, 56 of them. Now you have some sort of organization here. You've got some sort of organization. We can hash out our differences when we throw out the offending power. That's basically the mentality. But we need an army. Well, in the meantime, guess who's going to be doing the bulk of the fighting? The people. People's War. You know, later a book by Vo Nguyen Giap, Vietnam, that Vietnamese general. People's War, People's Army. These units come from the ranks of the people. And so, interestingly enough, the war really starts with battles up in the north, Lexington, Concord. And so the army, for the most part, is what? Northerners. Well, the Continental Congress, trying to breed some togetherness here, this cohesiveness, make who commanding general of the army? George Washington. Now, practically speaking, that does make sense. He had some sort of combat experience, leadership experience. But where's he from? Virginia. So the idea here is, well, if most of the army's in the north, let's have a southern commander so the north and the south can do what? Come together. And Washington is not a fan of guerrilla warfare or insurgency. But then again, people are fighting on their own turf. People are willing to fight if they think their farm, their home, their town is threatened. Hence the militia system. And so, as they begin to organize this army, it's going to be known as the Continental Army. And George Washington, when he went up to Massachusetts and saw some of the men he had, oh my God, what have I got myself into? Gotta have to start someplace. Gotta have to start someplace. And so this army will begin to organize 1775, 1776, 1777. But still, a lot of fighting is being done by, well, Minutemen for one thing. You know how that worked. You've seen the statue in Westport, right? The Minuteman? Yeah. Yeah. You know, the call goes out, the British are coming, and the call goes out, these guys grab their muskets off the mantle and their powder horn and their cap, and they all, you know, Joe Whiz in Alabama meet down at the Common here, and then they march off, and they're waiting for the British outside of town. They're waiting for the British to march by. And as the British march by, they're hiding behind trees, rocks, and stone walls. You take a few pot shots, and you retreat into the forest, and you're back home by 4 o'clock picking your potatoes. That's guerrilla warfare. What do you think the VC was doing to American troops? What do you think they were doing to the French? This is old. This is old. What is it we forgot about this in Iraq? Talk to some of these kids from that fought in Iraq, or Afghanistan for that. I might talk to my son. That's exactly my son faced in 2007, 2008 was what John Bull was facing here in 1776, 1777. What the heck did we forget about this? But organizing an army is a chore. If you read Mao Zedong's book on guerrilla warfare, he said anybody can learn military affairs. You don't have to go to West Point, Annapolis, or Sandhurst. Anybody can learn military affairs, especially through the school of hard knocks experience. He says, first you get a group of people together. And how do you get your arms? Well, you kill a policeman or two, a National Guardsman, soldier, you grab his arms and then retreat into the forest or the mountains. And the more you do this, the more arms you're going to get. Then people begin to organize. You get more people involved. And they begin to hit. You'll always hit against numbers smaller than yours. You don't want to fight pitched battles. That's how this starts here. Charles Lee tried to explain this to George Washington. Hey, look, George, that renegade British officer, you're not going to take the field against one of the world's best organized, successful armies. You're not going to do it. Your men know anything about bayonet charges? And if they do, are they any good with bayonets? You're going to be hiding behind trees, stone walls, and rocks. And yet, as this group of civilians becomes better acclimated to military affairs per combat experience, they begin to become more cohesive as far as units go. And so you begin to see this army form. And as Mao says in his book, people start as guerrilla units, 10, 15, 20. And if you're going to take on the enemy, if you have 20 men, you attack 10. If you see 20, don't even bother. Attack them when they're half your size, and then just retreat into the jungles or the mountains. And you do this, and this is a long process. It doesn't, victory doesn't happen overnight. But the people have to be on board. They have to be organized and be on board. But as this goes on, as people get combat experience, an army begins to be formed. And Mao says, eventually, this guerrilla group can be a conventional army. And that's precisely what's going to happen here. That's precisely what's going to happen here. The Continental Army will win a really good victory, in Saratoga, October 1777. And that's an important battle. It shows that the people organized into an army can take on the British regulars. That's an important battle from that perspective alone. But then again, as you're organizing this army, what does it take to have an army? Organization, logistics, also money. And here's where we get to the issue here. The money always is, isn't it? In the end, follow the money. Well, you have 13 colonies in a loose confederation here, each jealously guarding their independence. What does somebody in Georgia have in common with somebody in Rhode Island? Oh, isn't that some of the feeling here? Yeah, it is. But don't forget the Declaration of Independence. It is not only it's an article of faith, by the way. That's really your birth certificate, not one you get from a church, a hospital, or city hall. You are obligated to defend those precepts. As an American, those precepts in the Declaration of Independence, that seems to be conveniently forgotten. What a unifier that document is. And so you see here, as this army is being formed, this loose confederation, and they're going to have a document that's going to be your forerunner of your Constitution and Bill of Rights. It's called the Articles of Confederation. But it doesn't give the Continental Congress the power to tax. You're virtually at this point relying on the beneficence of some colonies to contribute to the cause. Now keep in mind, these guys in this Continental Army were supposed to be paid. You know, the officers were promised a half-pay pension for life. Where's that money going to come from? Where is that money going to come from? And they were also promised new clothes. You know, when the war is over with, the Continental Army, some of these units look like they lost the war. And some of these British units resplendent in those red coats and the boots and so on. And so they look like they won the war. They lost. They lost to a ragtag band, just like the Soviets are going to lose to a ragtag band in 1988 in Afghanistan. And they're going to pack up their stuff and go home in shame. Well, that's what's going to happen here to a certain extent. And so, you know, and it's interesting here too, 1778, 1780, 1781. Do you know there were American colonists here who did not want an American Continental Army unit bivouacked near their farm? Why is that? If they hadn't eaten in a couple of 3 days, guess what's going to happen to your farm? You're going to be missing a duck, a chicken, a goose, a cow, or a pig. These guys got to eat. Now keep in mind the dilemma for them. They have left their farms to go fight and leaving their wife and their kids to work the farm at home. It's a tough time here for these people. And I'm not so sure that's really appreciated here. I'm not so sure that's appreciated. But even by 1780, you know, when it's becoming apparent here that perhaps these people are going to win this war with help from the French, I'll give you that. We had help from the French. We're always looking to knock off the Brits somewhere along the line. In 1780, even up in Hartford, there was a revolt by a Connecticut regiment. These guys hadn't been paid. Some of them are hungry. What happened to a fresh round of clothes? I'm wearing rags. In the winter? You know, it wasn't uncommon to have 3 Continental soldiers, 3, 4, even 5 or 6, sharing the same coat. Yeah. What a dilemma that is. And they're too far gone now. They're too far into this to tell the British, we're sorry about this. The hardships are too bad. It's too late for that. You're going to have to see this through. 1781. A New Jersey regiment revolted. They even wanted to march on the Continental Congress. These guys hadn't been paid. This is hard here. You know, you can defeat the British. How can you defeat the elements? And this is not a together country by 1781, 1782, 1783. There are still differences here. In fact, in January of 1783, a Pennsylvania regiment revolted. And, you know, there had been a number of revolts, mutinies, if you want to call them that, with these regiments, looking to get paid, looking for new clothes, looking to eat. You know, it's nice to be patriotic. We all glorify in the courage of these people. But you know, it's nice to be patriotic. But I gotta eat. There is that reality. And so again, going back to some of these Continental soldiers bivouacking next to a farm, then there's going to be the occasional raid here. You know, when it's pretty bad when the people don't want their own army bivouac next door to them. Because now it becomes to the point what? That army they hoped would protect them now becomes an impediment. Can that breed discontent if it goes on too long? Yes. And so in that revolt, or that mutiny in New Jersey, in January of 1783, Washington will put this down himself. And he will order them, pick 4 of your ringleaders, which they do. He had 2 of them shot. That's a Stalinist approach. Well, then maybe not. Stalin would have had the whole regiment wiped out. That's what Stalin would have done. I remember Stalin talking about he was questioned about his penal battalions in World War II. Soldiers who had shown less than the required intestinal fortitude in battle were put into these penal battalions, who, by the way, if they had shown that intestinal fortitude, might be put back into a regular line regiment. That's if you survive. At one point, he had 178,000 men in these formations. And when questioned about it, Stalin would say, it takes a brave man to be a coward in the Red Army. You got to admit, he had a macabre sense of humor, Uncle Joe. That's what he was called here. And so you see here going into January, February 1783. Let's not. It's one thing when the common everyday private, corporal, and sergeant is restive. That's an issue. I'll give you that. In fact, we didn't have the problem the French will have in 1917 in the horrors of those trenches, and nobody's moving, and millions are getting killed. For what? 54 divisions of French, 54 divisions mutinied. Multiply that by 13,000, 14,000 men and see what you come up with. You can't have that. Fortunately, we didn't have that here. But that's the potential here. That's the potential. But when the officers begin to gripe, that's more political. That's a problem. And so closeted up in Newburgh, New York, are the officers. That's the officers' camp. And some are restive. We haven't been paid. We need new uniforms. We also want to eat. Of course, officers maybe have a little better accommodations than the common everyday rifle toter. And this begins to be a real issue here. In fact, to the point, and it's hazy here, their part in this. Keep in mind, the Continental Congress, you have people like Alexander Hamilton, Gouverneur Morris, people like this who want a strong central government. There are some, like perhaps, along the Madison-Jefferson fringe here, who do not want quite a strong central government. And so to the point where it's supposedly where Hamilton got involved with this and promised the Army, promised these officers more of what they want if they would support the political agenda. And that really hasn't been proven, but supposedly that's what happened here. Does that border on treasonable, or can that lead to that? Military takeover? There were some officers who wanted George Washington to take control. That would have turned us into a military dictatorship or another banana republic. George III was told, later on when he was told that George Washington is not going to make a grab for the country. A la Napoleon, out of like Caesar or Oliver Cromwell or somebody like that. This nation's blessed in this regard, by the way. I don't think we appreciate that either. And George III was told that, George Washington is not going to take control of the country. And George III is supposed to have said, if he does, he'd be the greatest human. If he does that, he'd be the greatest human being in the world. And that's exactly what George Washington's going to do. He won't take control of the country. He won't take control of the country. And so on March 15, 1783, in this restive atmosphere, he goes to Newburgh. And he will address these officers. And he will stand before them. And some officers can't look at him. I mean, some of these guys had been in Washington from day one till now. And George Washington, I don't know how many people realize this, was a fan of stage play. Not that he was an actor, but you think that he was. He's giving a speech to these officers explaining here the rudiments of building a new country and the idea of patience. This isn't going to happen right away. You have to give the Continental Congress a chance to build this nation. And you have to be patient and wait. And at one point, he makes great fanfare of taking his glasses out of his blouse and putting the glasses on. And he begins to, as he's reading the speech. And the officers, some of these officers are looking at each other. They didn't know that, George Washington makes the point to this group of officers. You have lost something, referencing money, clothing, and so on and so forth. And he says, I have lost something in service of my country too, my eyesight. What do you think happened to the wind in those sails? There won't be a mutiny. Again, it's dangerous when the officers do so. All you have to do is look through history. Gaddafi, wasn't he a colonel? How about Gamal Abdel Nasser? How about Franco? Yeah. History's replete with people. Caesar? History's replete with this. Soldiers would be paid, were supposed to get 4 months back pay. Officers would get half pay pension for life. Many of them were given IOUs for this. Just like some of the colonists themselves who took IOUs in expectation of getting paid back when we had a functioning system of representative government and the bonds could be paid off. Guess what's going to happen to some of these guys, though, in the end? Some can't wait. Some will have to sell these IOUs for maybe a percentage of what they're really worth. And so who's really going to reap the benefits in the end? Those who took a shot and bought them. But there won't be a mutiny here. In fact, it's really not until 1818 when the families of some of these soldiers will reap some financial benefit from the United States government. And we talk about the shabby treatment, and rightfully so, accorded some Vietnam veterans when they came home. Apparently there's a track record here. Interesting here what happened. But don't think for one moment your founders will forget this. As they are putting together this country you call the United States, things like the Newburgh incident, things like a standing army that the British have, that resonates with what you call Congress. And so they are going to put together a military system after this. When you have your Constitution and your attendant Bill of Rights after 1787, where you look at your Second Amendment and what does it say? The right to bear arms, the militia system, so on and so forth. And that's bolstered in 1792 by the Militia Act. And so after this incident, which affects Congress, which really affects Congress, they don't want any regiments marching on Congress, demanding money, clothes, and food. And so to prevent this, when you have this nation finally being formed, approximately 3 million people in 13 states, they are so cognizant of this, you're only going to have an army of 2,630 men. How are 2,630 men supposed to guard 3 million people in 13 states? They're not. She's shaking her head no. Yeah, that's a stretch. The militia system. Each state, it's in the 1792 Militia Act. All white males ages 18 to 45 will be part of the militia system. And they're controlled by the governors. They really want to disperse military power. It's controlled by the governors. And the states appoint the officers. And the guys buy their own guns. And it states in the Militia Act, 1792, that when the president federalizes these, they're not called National Guard, folks, they're called militia. That National Guard term is over a century away here. You know, the president can federalize the militias, but according to the 1792 Militia Act, at this point, 2 months, 3 months, and that's it. Then you have to go back and justify why you need them for more than 3 months. So power resided with what? The states. And you don't have to pay them because these guys in these militias, these 18 to 45-year-olds, many of them are on farms, right? Many of them may have a job, or maybe them are seafaring men, whatever the case may be. You don't have to pay them. We're not saddled with that baggage. We owe them back money. Interesting concept on how they figure this out. And on top of that, you know, only an army of 2,630 men, as George Washington warns about later on when he leaves office, an over-bloated military. That's not an army that's going to go invade Iraq. The militia system is geared to what? Americans protecting their farms, their homes, their towns. That's what it's for. We're not going to go Gideon over here. My wife likes to say, you know, that Italian word, Gideon over here, and we're going to go invade someone else. That's not the case. It's for defense only. Interesting here what George Washington states in his farewell address, which, by the way, kind of resonates with Mr. Eisenhower's farewell address. Yeah. And also George Washington warned about parties. And he says here, while then every part of our country thus feels an immediate and particular interest in union, all the parts combined cannot fail to find in the united mass of means and efforts greater strength, greater resource, proportionally greater security from external danger, a less frequent interruption of our peace by foreign nations. And then he goes on here about wars, and so on and so forth. Hence, likewise, they will avoid the necessity of those overgrown military establishments, which under any form of government are inauspicious to liberty. What he warns. And which are to be regarded as particularly hostile to republican liberty, putting together a republic. In this sense, it is that your union ought to be considered as a main prop of your liberty, and that the love of one ought to endear you the preservation of the other. He is against a large standing army. And this guy was a general. Note Mr. Eisenhower is 61. Beware the military-industrial complex. This guy had been a general. Do they know what's what here? Yeah, they sure do. They sure do. Interesting here. Then again, you know, going back to having an army. And again being that your army was formed as a people's army. That's how this is formed, as a people's army. Understand here what Vladimir Lenin once said. And this really accentuates the fact that by the time he says this, the Industrial Revolution has really taken root in society. Interesting what he says here. The best army in the world is bound to be annihilated unless it is backed up by a strong, well-organized home front. That's an interesting statement. And yet, there's also Sun Tzu, who wrote that book, The Art of War, 2,500 years ago, who stated, hence the wise general sees to it that his troops feed on the enemy. For 1 bushel of the enemy's provisions is equivalent to 20 of his. Interesting there. Well, you saw that during the American Revolution. You know, some of the troops would take the British provisions. Well, why not? British taxpayer paid for them. We didn't. We didn't. And so this idea of the threat of the Newburgh incident and related mutinies among the troops was not forgotten by your Congress, even to the extent they're going to remember this well into the 19th century. And that's not the original Congress. That's not the original Congress. The military wanted a 10,000-man army after the War of 1812. Guess what they're going to get? An 8,220-man army. And we had grown larger. Still the militia system. Again, the war between the states. And here's where the first real big threat comes. The first real big threat. That's an industrialized war, folks. You're seeing the rudiments of industrialized war with this war between the states, or as I like to call it, the revolt of the planters, which is going to be a 4-talk set coming up after this one. The revolt of the planters. To me, that's what you call the Civil War is. That collision between the Jeffersonian idea, the agrarian, the Hamiltonian idea of industrialization. And so when that war is over, the North has an army of 2,213,000 men. Regulars. Not part-timers. Regulars. And so, but still, the threat of having a large standing army is indelibly printed on, even in that Congress, after that war between the states. And, April 9, 1865, 2,213,000 men, and yet, by September 1867, 57,000 men. They eviscerated the army. And then by the time the year 1876, the year Custer bought the farm, the army's down to 26,000 men from 2,213,000. That huge Union Army was the largest armed force in the history of North America up to that point. And yet Congress did what? Emasculated it. Why? A large standing army was a threat to the Grand Republic. We don't want any mutinies. Not like with the Newburgh incident and related. Wow. Interesting what you see here when you consult your history. In fact, in that handout I gave you, there are a couple of books in that abbreviated bibliography where some of this information came from, or studies. And it's really an aspect of American history that kind of gets the short shrift here. Americans having mutinies in their army? That can't be. Yeah, it can be. When people have to eat, when people aren't getting the clothes they were promised, and they're not getting paid, people do get antsy when they're not paid. Of course, sometimes that depends on the society you're in. Sometimes that depends on the society you're in. For instance, in World War II on the Eastern Front, some of these Russian soldiers who had fought in that epic battle of Stalingrad, some of these guys will walk from February 3, 1943 into Berlin by April 1945. That's 1,000 miles. They'll march it. And some of these Russian soldiers were not paid, and some fought World War II without leave. Wow. I always like to fight that army. Interesting. Military power in different societies. Fascinating. But then again, go back to your own. The idea of a large standing army was an anathema to many of your founders. In fact, I even brought something here that from the Federalist. Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. Interesting here, some of what they say. And Federalist number 8. And you can see this today. You can see this somewhat today. Hamilton warns on page 46 in Federalist number 8. War accentuates the power of the executive. He warned about that then. Interesting how that is. Interesting how this is. And then Madison warns in Federalist 46 that one way to prevent an army that's really not necessary, or an overbloated military as warned by George Washington, is the unity of the states. And that makes sense when you compare that militia system to what he's saying here. The states have to be unified. That's another check and balance that your founders put together on the executive. You know, we all like to talk about the checks and balances between Congress, the chief executive, and the Supreme Court. And also that check on you known as electors, which seems to have some fuss and feathers with some people, especially some Democrats I know, because they lost 2 elections. Not your problem. But there's also the states, the unity of the states, the unity of the people. And Madison warns here in this Federalist number 56 that when there's a lack of cohesion with the people, what will fill that void? One of the things that will fill that void is a strong military. And because as the people become more fractured, an unseemly ruler can use that army to keep you in line. He warns about that in Federalist 46. So it's interesting what some of your founders are writing have come to pass. Why? This system of checks and balances for your republic. That gets me too. Some of these people, some of these hotshot politicians we got, they constantly refer to us as a democracy. What happened to the word republic? I pledge of allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the democracy for which it stands. When the heck they changed that? I mean, you read this, and that's another thing. You read this, many of your founders were not fans of what you call democracy. They weren't fans of that. Republic, a system of checks and balances. But again, this unity of the states. Of course, maybe it was a little easier to have unity of the states if you can do it when you got 13, 15, or 20. Maybe harder with 50. Because now you're talking about disparate sections of the country. And you know people even up here, you know, they talk about different areas of the country. Mississippi? You know, really? Or maybe some of those people down there, why would you want to go to New England for? Does that breed cohesion? No. No. Yeah, maybe a disaster like Florence does, because you've got volunteers from New York going down there to help those people. Maybe it takes a disaster to do that. World War II, anybody? Yeah. And so when you take a look at what some of your founders are writing here in the Federalist, George Washington with his farewell address, proponents of no overbloated military. And then you get somebody like a Dwight Eisenhower who repeats virtually the same thing in 1961. Interesting. And even Colin Powell. One more point. Colin Powell, after Vietnam, who knew the Army was shot. Him and Don Starry and Ben Traynor and others who put together that Army after Vietnam, an all-volunteer Army, and Colin Powell. That Army should not be used unless at the behest of the American people. What happened with that one? Interesting. Anybody have any comments or questions? Oh yeah, you're getting into some of those places like Georgia and the Carolinas, and that brings up people like Thomas Sumter, Francis Marion, renowned as the Swamp Fox, and you had quite a difference of opinion down there between some of these Tories and Loyalists, as well as, we'll call these colonists patriots who want that divorce from the crown. And in many instances, this went on. There was as much fighting between the colonists here as there were between patriotic colonists and the British Army. And there were instances here where colonists are hanging each other, shooting each other. That went on. But you know who was better organized? The so-called patriotic colonists. Again, led by people like Thomas Sumter and Francis Marion, and there were others. And they had the support of the people who wanted that divorce from the crown. They were better organized. And that's what Mao is later going to say. Mao is later going to use the analogy that for a guerrilla or a people's army to succeed, they have to be acceptable or make themselves acceptable by the people. And he uses the analogy, the guerrillas are the fish and the people are the sea. And if they can swim in that sea, guess who's going to win in the long run? Well, in our case, the Patriots. And that's exactly what's going to happen, because Thomas Sumter and Francis Marion would hit the British soldiers or hit the Tories and then go back into the Carolina swamps. And the British Army couldn't catch them. They couldn't stop them. Because why? One of the big reasons is they had the support of a lot of the people down there who would give them the shirt, the pants, the boots, the occasional gun, and also something else they gave them that guerrillas need to succeed: information. Even to the point where children, you keep your eyes and your ears open. You see something that can help the guerrillas, you tell an adult, and the adult passes it on to the guerrillas. That's part what Andy Jackson was doing as a kid. And so even children are involved in this, if it's organized. And this is what Mao said later on. Even 5-year-old kids. Keep your eyes and ears open. You tell an adult, they tell us, we'll handle it from there. And so even children are part of a guerrilla army. Now, I'll ask you a question. Does that mean children are combatants and can be shot? Now you're opening up the vista here. You're opening up the vista here. But when a people want to win, children are part of this. And so, but that happened, you're right, down south. And there were some, you could, in fact, in some of these places down in the Carolinas, you would occasionally see maybe a Tory hanging off a tree like a Christmas decoration. But that's a people's war, and people's wars can be ugly. They can be ugly. And I mean, you saw this in the Russian Civil War. I mean, not many people died in the revolution itself. It's the Civil War where the Grim Reaper really reaped the harvest here. And there were a lot of people on both sides, the whites and the reds, killing each other. It's a civil war. And so that shows what? A real degeneration of societal cohesion here. It's fascinating. It's fascinating to study this stuff. It really is. But you are quite right. Yes, there was that warfare among the people, and Bannister Tarleton was a British Army officer who tried to take advantage of this. And he was a brutal guy. He was a brutal guy. And so some of the so-called civilized norms of warfare, they don't apply here. And believe it or not, you saw the same thing in the Soviet Union in World War II. Especially in a place like Ukraine. And there were Ukrainian nationalists who wanted to depart the Soviet Union, and there were Ukrainians who wanted to remain part of the Soviet Union. Don't you have that today? West Ukraine, Eastern Ukraine area? Yeah, you sure do. And so there were fights between these Ukrainian guerrilla groups, who some were also fighting the Nazis, some were fighting the Red Army. The Red Army even parachuted officers in to take control of some of these guerrilla groups. And Ukraine, it's estimated that out of the 25 million Soviet dead, some analysts have said upwards of 8 million died in Ukraine. And Ukraine was that Belarusia was another one. It was a battle zone. I mean, a horrible battle. So you have not only the Soviet army fighting the invading German army, but fighting among Soviets and Ukrainians, and then Ukrainians who want to stay with the Soviets. It's mixed up. And so if you're a peasant living there, what do you do? But you had the same sort of thing on a smaller scale to a certain extent down south. And so, yeah. It's like anything else. When you start, and this was here too, that when you start a guerrilla group, it's like let me preface that by saying John Adams stated, that at the start of the American Revolution, 1/3 of the colonists were blue, I guess like true blue. 1/3 were Tories. One third were timid. You know how it is, the fence sitters. You got that with everything in any human endeavor, right? You got the fence, oh, I don't know if I want to do this. This might happen, whatever. No, you got the fence sitters. And so if you're going to start a guerrilla group, and you see this even here, if you have people who support you, fine. You have people who are benign or neutral, you keep an eye on them. You have people who are against you. Well, I don't have to tell you what you have to do. Go back to that incident up in New Milford in 1775, outlined by Crane Britton in his book, Anatomy of Revolution. Yeah. And they're going to indulge in the most sordid of behavior. That happened here. And I'm not going to go into detail there because you're probably going to be going home to eat dinner soon. So it's true. We can laugh, but it's true. And so you saw that here. And so, when you take a look at the American Revolution in that fashion, and then see what happened later on in France in 1789, or Russia, or China, or Vietnam, the shades are here. Our own country. And so when we go into these countries, what is it we forgot about our own revolution? But then again, the other side here is, going back to this so-called Newburgh incident, which again, more ought to be discussed or written about this. And it's an interesting event in American history where, you had mutinies in the Continental Army. And that sometimes strikes people. Here? Yeah, here. People are people. They're not immune to it. If you're not getting paid, you're not getting food, you're not getting new clothes, hey, you're not going to be happy. Like I said earlier, nice to talk about liberty and freedom, but I got to eat. So it's interesting to see. Yes? Yeah. Yeah. That's another part of the story, too. What was the name of that general who was a rival of Washington? Horatio Gates. He's the one who wins the Battle of Saratoga. And he thought, I won that battle, and so he ought to be given the primary position of commanding the army. Won't happen. Supposedly, he is involved in machinations up at Newburgh, and Washington knew this, and which is why he went there to make that speech on March 15, 1783. And so in the end, who are many of these officers going to be allied to? Gates or Washington? Washington. And then to the point where, Washington has such esteem, he wanted to go home. No, you got to run for president. And so he'll run for president, and after his first term, I want to go home. No, you got to stick around for a second. And finally, after the second term, that's when he states, I'm going home. And rightfully so. And he kind of, without legislation, really begins to set that trend for the two-term president. And that'll really take shape here. Until FDR, of course. And then they make it a law. But George Washington really sets that trend here. And he sets the trend with what? Farewell addresses by presidents. So George is really a real trendsetter here. He really is. Was he a landowner? Yeah. Did he want more land? Yeah, I'll give you that. But you can't. Yeah, sure. Well, that's what some of this is about too. Again, go back to land. But then again, you listen to John Adams, who states, who believed everyone should have some land. He says, if you don't have the wide ownership of land here, you're not going to have a functioning system of representative government. So Adams wasn't stupid. You got to give the people something, or else are they going to go along with this? No, not eventually. And so when I see that, and then I see the reality here of Blackstone Financial, the hedge fund, as the nation's largest landlord, to me that's not a very good sign. Right. Well, but money is tight, and what money there is, how much is it worth? You know, I mean, again, go back to the Currency Act of 1764. Although, in some respects, you know, some of the, you know, at one point you got 13 colonies, almost with 13 different currencies. How's that going to work as far as unity, cohesion? Again, go back to what I mentioned earlier. Some of these colonies are jealously guarding their independence. They're almost like they're little fiefdoms here. And so, however, some would, you know, be able to gauge the amount of money they need per the economic interaction. And if the economic interaction slows, well, then you cut back on the money supply to cut back on inflation. But still, how much is this money really worth? And then the Crown doesn't want to accept this money to pay back the banks. They want gold and silver. But at the same time here, yeah, that's right. You know, basically what you're expecting here is these colonies, they're not states yet, these colonies to offer or give whatever the army needs, because this is supposed to be a national army. Is it really a national army? You know, and so there are a lot of speed bumps in this road to achieving unity. And so you're quite right. You know, and people are having problems at home. And keep in mind, when the British arrive at your farm, what do you think they're doing? They're going to take some of the pigs, some of the cows, some of the chickens. And so how are you supposed to contribute to the war effort? That's a problem. And so is that going to breed discontent? Yeah, it is. And that goes back to what you're saying here about the Tories and the loyalists, Tories and the colonists down in the South, especially. Yeah, it's a problem. But George Washington was pleading the case of the soldiers. You better bail these guys out. You saw the incident here. You better bail these. But at the same time, he's the same one that's going to say, he's going to learn the lesson, we don't want a large standing army. Over-bloated militaries. He's pleading both causes here is what he's doing. But none of this will be solved until you have a functioning system of representative government. And then in the end, who's really going to be the savior in the end anyway? Alexander Hamilton, when he straightens out the nation's finances. But this is a protracted a problem here, and you know, it's going to take a while before they solve it. So George Washington really has to be given a lot of credit when he tells these officers at Newburgh, you need to have patience as we put together our nation. Our nation. And he makes the point with his glasses, even I lost something in service of our country. No, you know, our country? What country? You don't have a constitution yet. The implication. And so, you know, Washington wasn't stupid. Washington wasn't stupid. But that was an issue here. You know, while he's telling these guys to have some patience, he's urging Congress, you better make amends with these guys or this is going to be a problem. This is going to be a problem. I mean, the worst thing you want to see is them start, you know, really having massive firing squads and start shooting some of these officers. That's not going to go over well. And then you might as well have a banana republic. You might as well grab Congress and take it over. But we don't go that route. And that I think it is. When you look at history of different countries, we really are that Halley's Comet that comes along here periodically, you know? And I don't think, I don't think we really teach that too well in this country. Yeah, you know. And so, but, I mean, as you point out, though, this is a bumpy road here. You know, well, we won the revolution. What does that mean? What does that mean? And so when you take a look at what happens at Newburgh, and keep in mind some British soldiers are still here. Not all of them have been evacuated. That's a problem. That's a problem. And of course, to add a little insult to injury here, not that it really impacted it, but at least 10,000 slaves are going to leave the South because the British promised them, well, you know where some of these people are going to wind up? Down in the Caribbean. They were better off they stayed here. They wanted to leave, so out they went. On the side issue. But again, you know, when you look at this, there were bumps along the way, even after Yorktown, 1781. you're not going to have a constitution to really vote on by these so-called states until 1787. And so that's 6 years worth of bumps. And again, some of these colonies are still jealously guarding, and they're going to have to give up some of their independence to form a nation. And that was frowned upon by some. So there's a lot of backing and filling to go on here. And so it wasn't like, well, we won at Yorktown, we're a nation. It wasn't that easy. It's not that. Not that at all. Because if these officers get their way, what is that? Counter-revolution. Then the games begin. Of course, then you tear yourselves apart internally. And keep in mind, not all the British troops had left. That would be a problem. Because they don't think in England. Now's the time to grab it. They're fighting amongst themselves. Or let's separate the New England colonies from the rest and split them. Interesting. Fascinating. And that happened in the War of 1812. In 1814, when the British were going to invade from Plattsburgh, the idea was to separate New England states from the rest. It didn't work because the British task force on Lake Champlain was defeated by an American task force, and you didn't have a road system up there. The logistics are stymied. And so the British will not invade Plattsburgh. Another episode that really isn't talked about too much. But that's what the British wanted to do. And that was going back to Horatio Gates. Again, in 1777, the British were going to march down the Hudson River, Lake Champlain, the Lake Champlain, Lake George, Hudson River access, and separate New England colonies from the rest of them. And Gates will defeat the British at Saratoga in 1777. And that invasion comes to naught. And the British tried this in the fall of 1776. Battle of Valcour Island. The first real American task force in our history will fight the British at Valcour Island. You know who commanded that? Benedict Arnold. General Benedict Arnold really commands the first American task force. A navy they built from the forest up near Lake Champlain. But at this point, keep in mind, the climate's changed here. There's that word again. By end of October, November 1776, it's getting cold up there. And so that river traffic is eventually going to dry up because what's going to happen to parts of Lake Champlain and Lake George? Freeze. Yeah, from Norwich, Connecticut. Yeah, he was one of really the talented, I guess, commanders in the beginning of the war. But he was, I guess, seduced by the Brits and will be considered a traitor. But he was one of the American commanders, like in the beginning of the Revolution. I mean, he was energetic enough. I mean, a general. Of course, we don't have a navy yet, and so you're going to have to ask somebody to command that American task force. And they asked Benedict Arnold, and so they will put up a courageous struggle against superior numbers on Lake Champlain, led by Benedict Arnold. But he will eventually be seduced by the Brits, and I guess that part of that I'm not really too fluent with, as far as George Washington liking or disliking Benedict Arnold. But then I guess goes along the lines of, again, Horatio Gates, who felt slighted because he won the Battle of Saratoga. I win the big one in the beginning of the war, yet no one's paying attention to me. They leave George Washington as commander-in-chief of the army, a general who by the end of the war will lose more battles than he wins. But they won. Why? Because they outlasted the British. They outlasted them. And why did we lose in Vietnam? They outlasted us. How come the Russians lost in Afghanistan? The Mujahideen outlasted them. We helped them, that's true. That's true, we helped them. But they outlasted them. And of course, things weren't going well at home anyway for the Soviet Union. So there's a conglomeration of things here. But these people still outlasted them. And so we're going to leave Iraq in 2011. Why? Because basically then they outlasted us. Americans don't like being stuck in a situation too long. And that's understandable. But it's interesting here, yeah. That would deserve a talk too. Benedict Arnold and George Washington here. But again, you know, I mean, he was one of those. Wasn't like he wasn't talented. He was. But you know, personalities, emotions, whatever the case may be, and you have a separation here. Every country breeds this. Every country breeds this. People are people the world over. Interesting what you saw here with the revolution. But yeah, by 1781, even though they had won the Battle of Yorktown, there's a long haul here, a long slog. The fighting's over, but now the politics take over. That's a problem. Especially when you don't pay or feed or give a change of clothes to your army. They're not going to be happy. Therein lies that lesson. So, which I am assuming some of you are probably thinking, maybe we ought to have a functioning system to help the troops when they come home from Iraq, Afghanistan, whatever the case may be. Yeah, be a good idea. Be a good idea. In fact, now I understand from the commander of the Post 12 in Norwalk that there's a movement afoot to get these guys who were exposed to the burn pits in Iraq further relief from the bronchial problems and everything else that they were having. So I guess it's reminiscent of, if you want to use the term, you want to use that event in Vietnam with Agent Orange. Look how long it took. Yeah, I mean, you ask these people to go overseas, and well, you don't really have a problem, or it must be akin to something else, or whatever the case may be. I mean, talk to some of these kids. They can tell you some stories. They really can. So, and then again, go back to what happened to these guys after the Newburgh incident. Many of them never really got that money, or it took a long time to pay them. It took a long time to pay them. Of course, you're putting together a country, it's going to take a long time to pay them. And so you're not going to have a functioning financial system until into the 1890s, when Alexander Hamilton finally gets rid of the debt. That's a long time to wait. A long time to wait. Talk about patience. Now, 1818 is when the families will get relief from Congress. No, the 1790s. Right, yeah. Thank you. But, yeah, and so that's still a long time, especially when you're waiting to get paid. Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, right. And so, well, I mean, it's what the lesson Congress gets out of this is we've taught these guys to fight, so we better take care of them. But considering the economics of this country, that's going to be a tall order. And so that's what the lesson Congress is going to learn. We don't want a large standing army. We don't want a bunch of well-trained soldiers who are used to kill, pressing their demands. Which, again, when you look at that situation that way, one man who will understand this after 1945 is George Kennan. And so when you have, and this isn't a problem the founders had, this is a problem this country will have. According to the VA, 16,112,000 Americans were in a uniform by September 2nd, 1945. And that is 12.2% of the American population. And so I remember you were probably weaned on this too. Well, the Marshall Plan saved the world. One of the co-authors of that was George Kennan. And one of the reasons you're going to have a Marshall Plan, they know out of 16,112,000 Americans, 15 million are going to be out of a uniform, and you better have a job for them when you get home, and when they get home. And so what are they doing with the Marshall Plan? They're going to rebuild Western Europe and Japan as a dumping ground for American goods, and that gets these guys a job. That's the reality. That's basically what you're doing. Nice to say we saved the world, but let's understand the reality here. And on top of that, some of the women that were in the war plants, where are they going back to? The kitchen. Although, you know, realistically here, you know, it's going to be that's one of the biggest boosters of women elevating their status is World War I and World War II. Even though many will go back to being homebodies, if you want to call it that, that trend is going to be already set. You're going to have a two-wage earner economy eventually, and women are going to be in the workforce. You know, it's kind of late to say, sorry, ladies, the deal is off, back to the kitchen. Kind of late at that point. But George Kennan understands this. But, I mean, that's 1945, 46, not 1785. The difference in years here, difference in circumstances. But the basic idea is the same. Better have something for these guys to do. You trained them. You trained them to kill. You don't want them coming home in a foul mood. Might be a problem. Might be a problem. So, well, look at Iraq. When we went into Iraq, the de-Baathification program. We dispersed or cashiered the Iraqi army, and what happened? You got a 40, 50% unemployment. No, Bush did. George Bush did. That was the Bush administration when we invaded Iraq. L. Paul Bremer. Right. Get rid of that army. And, oh, you mean in Libya? And that was another disaster. But yeah, but when you get these guys, they got a 40 or 50% unemployment rate, and they're no longer working as soldiers. What are they going to do? If you don't give them a job, what are they going to do? Grab an AK and start shooting at you. So, yeah, that's a problem. That's a problem. There's a, well, it's not a mutiny, but a backlash from soldiers. Wow. What was it, George Patton? When he had his military district in Germany he was supposed to oversee, and he got complaints. Well, you're keeping the Nazis on in some government functions. Well, when you send me the trained personnel to run the phones, run the water, run the electricity, I'll fire the Nazis. It's hard to figure out here. So, you have to maintain some sort of cohesion and maintain the peace. You know, Patton can rail all he wants about how we gave away Prague and Berlin. You know, we have an army in World War II. We only had an army of 89 divisions in World War II, plus 6 Marine Corps divisions. You know how many divisions of the Red Army Stalin had in Eastern Europe at one point? 300. And you're going to tell him to get out? I don't think that's happening. Uncle Joe would go, I'm going to be doing the Alien and Sedition Acts next week, and I'm going to get into that Espionage Act like with 1917, 1918 too, and then we can even bring up the whistleblowers today who are being prosecuted under the Espionage Act. They're whistleblowers, they're not spies. So, but that's what we'll do next week. Have yourselves a good evening. Thank you.